The contract slid across the polished boardroom table while 20 executives watched me lose everything in silence. My CEO, Victor Hale, didn't even look guilty, just bored, like he was canceling a meeting instead of stripping away my royalties and firing me in the same breath. Sign it. I stared down at the licensing agreement. My name had been removed completely. For years of my life erased. Every clause I'd negotiated, every percentage point I'd earned through countless late nights and crisis calls, all of it gone. Replaced with language that made me sound like a temporary consultant instead of the architect who had designed the entire framework. You're no longer part of the deal, Victor said, checking his watch like I was wasting his time. My hands started shaking under the table. I pressed my palms flat against my thighs, trying to steady myself. Security guards stood near the door, their presence making it clear this wasn't a discussion. This was a termination dressed up as a business decision. I tasted metal in my mouth, that sharp copper flavor that comes from biting down too hard on nothing. My chair scraped loudly against the floor when I stood up. The sound echoed in the too quiet room, and I watched as every single person avoided meeting my eyes. The CFO suddenly found his coffee cup fascinating. Someone coughed awkwardly. Victor flipped through pages of the contract like I was already forgotten, like I was a problem he just solved by signing a few documents. I walked toward the door with my head up, even though my vision was blurring. Each step felt impossibly heavy, like I was wading through deep water. The boardroom that had once felt like my second home now felt like a courtroom where I'd been sentenced without a trial. As I passed Victor's chair, he spoke without looking up from the papers. You built something incredible, Karen, he said softly, almost gently. Then he added the line that would echo in my head for weeks. But leadership requires loyalty. The words hit me harder than any insult could have. The room felt smaller with every step. I could feel 20 pairs of eyes on my back, all of them watching, none of them speaking up. I kept my expression neutral until the elevator doors finally closed. Then I leaned against the cold metal wall and let the tears come. The headline appeared on my phone before I even reached the parking garage. I was still sitting in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to process what had just happened when the notification buzzed. Victor Hale finalizes historic $5 billion licensing deal. The article was already live on 3 major business sites. There were photos of Victor shaking hands with investors, smiling that confident smile he'd perfected over the years. The write-up praised his vision, his strategic thinking, his ability to close complex international partnerships. My name appeared exactly once, buried in the middle of the article, with contributions from internal teams. Internal teams. As if I were interchangeable. As if anyone could have done what I did. My phone buzzed again and again. Congratulations messages meant for Victor. Former colleagues forwarding the article with excited comments. Industry contacts asking if I'd seen the news about Victor's big win. I stared at the screen until the words blurred together. For years of my life had just been reduced to a vague reference to internal teams. I wasn't just unemployed. I was erased from the story completely, like I had never existed at all. My name is Karen Hines. I'm a white American product strategist who spent her entire career building systems that worked so smoothly, people forgot they needed building at all. I wasn't the type to chase credit or demand recognition. I didn't need my name on every presentation or my photo in every press release. I just wanted to do excellent work and be compensated fairly for it. Victor Hale used to call me the quiet engine behind everything. He'd say it during company meetings, usually right before announcing another successful quarter or closed deal. People would clap politely, and I'd nod from my seat, comfortable in my role as the person who made complicated things simple. But somewhere along the way, quiet engine became code for invisible. And invisible became convenient when Victor decided he didn't want to share credit or royalties anymore. I had joined his company when it was still small, back when he actually did the work himself instead of just talking about it. I watched him grow from a scrappy founder to a CEO with 3 assistants screening his calendar. And I believed him when he said we were building something together. 6 months before that boardroom meeting, I started noticing small changes. Nothing dramatic, nothing I could point to as proof of anything wrong. Just little shifts in the atmosphere that made my instincts start buzzing. My calendar began shrinking. Meetings I'd normally be included in just disappeared from my schedule. When I asked about it, Victor's assistant would say something vague about streamlining communications or reducing overlap. Then my presentation started coming back edited, with Victor's name moved above mine on the title slides. When I mentioned it to him directly, he smiled that easy, reassuring smile. "We're just aligning messaging," he said. "The board likes seeing consistency in our executive communications." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe this was really about brand consistency and not about slowly writing me out of the story. But my stomach sank anyway, that deep instinctive knowledge that something was wrong even when you can't prove it yet. I started paying closer attention after that. I noticed how Victor would present my ideas in meetings, rephrasing them just slightly so they sounded like his own thoughts. The first real fight happened over royalties. We were in his office, just the two of us, reviewing the preliminary terms for the big licensing deal. I pointed to a clause that reduced my percentage from what we'd originally agreed on. "That clause stays at the original percentage," I told him calmly, keeping my voice steady even though my pulse was racing. Victor leaned back in his expensive leather chair, fingers steepled under his chin. He studied me for a long moment before speaking. "Karen," he said slowly, like he was explaining something simple to someone who wasn't quite understanding. "You're an employee, not a partner. There's a difference." The words hung in the air between us. I felt my face flush hot, then cold. "I built the technical framework," I said. "I negotiated with the partners. I designed the validation protocols. The contract specifically guarantees royalties based on that work." "Contracts change," he replied. His voice was still calm, but there was steel underneath it now. "The board feels that executive compensation should be aligned with current org structure." That was the moment I realized Victor had been planning this for months. He wasn't surprised by my resistance. He was prepared for it. I didn't yell or threaten or storm out dramatically. Instead, I started preparing quietly, methodically, the way you prepare for a storm you can see building on the horizon. I archived every email related to the licensing deal. I documented my contributions to every major milestone, complete with timestamps and correspondence showing which ideas came from me. I stored contract versions off-site, in cloud folders Victor couldn't access. I backed up technical documentation and partner communication logs. It wasn't revenge I was planning. It was survival. I needed proof that I existed, that I'd done the work, that the agreements weren't just verbal promises Victor could deny later. I needed evidence that my name belonged on those contracts, that the royalty structure wasn't some favor he'd granted out of generosity but compensation I'd earned through actual results. I also did something else, something that felt almost paranoid at the time but would become crucial later. I read every single clause in the licensing agreement. Not just the main sections, but the appendices. The technical requirements. The validation protocols. Most people never read appendices. I did. The external partners called me directly whenever something broke. Not Victor. Not his executive team. Me. We had built relationships over hundreds of hours of problem solving together. Late-night calls when servers crashed. Weekend sessions debugging integration issues. Crisis meetings when regulatory requirements suddenly shifted and we needed to redesign entire protocols within days. Those relationships weren't based on contracts or hierarchy. They were based on trust, on my ability to understand their technical constraints and find solutions that actually worked instead of just sounding good in presentations. When Paolo from the European partner called at 2 a.m. because their compliance team flagged a validation issue, he called me. When Yuki from the Asian subsidiary needed clarity on data architecture, she emailed me directly. When the integration lead in South America hit roadblocks, he scheduled calls with me, not with Victor's team. Victor knew this, of course. He'd sometimes mention it in meetings, usually framing it as a positive. But he never fully understood what those relationships meant. He thought they were about technical details. He didn't realize they were about respect. The final presentation to the board happened 3 weeks before they fired me. Victor was leading it, using slides I'd created, presenting analysis I'd compiled over months of detailed work. I sat in my usual spot near the back of the room, watching him navigate through complex technical explanations with the kind of confidence that comes from not actually understanding the material. He stumbled over terminology I used every day. He oversimplified concepts in ways that made me wince. He couldn't answer follow-up questions without glancing at me for help. But people clapped anyway. They congratulated him on his vision, his leadership, his strategic thinking. They praised the innovative approach he'd taken, never mind that the innovation was mine. I forced a smile, nodded when people looked my way, played the supportive team member role I'd been playing for years. But inside, something shifted. A hardness settled into my chest, replacing the softer belief that things would work out fairly if I just kept doing good work. I realized that Victor wasn't going to share credit. He wasn't going to honor our agreements. I left that meeting and went straight to my office to add more evidence to my archive. The calendar invite never came. I should have been in the final closing meeting, the one where the board would vote to approve the licensing deal and authorize the financial terms. My contract explicitly stated I was part of the deal governance structure. But when I checked my calendar that morning, there was nothing scheduled. Just a blank space where the most important meeting of the year should have been. I called Victor's assistant. She sounded uncomfortable, apologetic in that way people get when they're following orders they don't agree with. "I'm sorry, Karen. Victor said the meeting was executives only this time." Executives only. I was technically an executive. But apparently not the right kind anymore. I watched from my home office as LinkedIn exploded with congratulations. Photos of Victor with investors, champagne glasses raised, everyone celebrating the successful deal closure. The press releases went out. The stock price jumped. And I sat alone in my kitchen, staring at my computer screen, watching my work being celebrated while my name was nowhere to be found. That night, I realized Victor had timed everything perfectly. Then he'd removed me before the final vote. Buried in Appendix D, Section 12, Paragraph 3 of the licensing agreement was a technical requirement that most people glossed over when reading the contract. It required a formal validation memo from the lead technical architect confirming that all integration protocols met specification and that quality assurance procedures had been properly documented. The memo had to be signed and submitted before the deal could be fully executed. Without it, the partners could invoke a 90-day review period that would delay everything and potentially trigger renegotiation clauses. Victor had never read the appendices carefully. I knew this because during contract review meetings, he'd skip straight to the financial terms and leave the boring technical stuff for me to handle. That trust was about to become very expensive. The lead technical architect was me. The contract explicitly named me in that role, back when Victor still needed me. My name was in the governance structure, printed in black and white on documents filed with regulatory agencies. Victor couldn't produce that validation memo without me. And I hadn't sent it yet. I sat at my kitchen table looking at the draft memo I'd prepared weeks ago. Complete, accurate, ready to submit. Instead, I saved it to my encrypted drive and closed my laptop. The phone started ringing 2 weeks after the supposed deal closure. First it was Paolo from the European team, his voice carefully neutral on the voicemail. "Karen, I heard about your departure. I wanted to reach out personally. There are some questions about the technical validation that we'd appreciate your perspective on." Then Yuki from Asia, "We haven't received the final architect memo yet. The regulatory team is asking about timeline." Then the integration lead from South America, "Is there a reason the validation documentation hasn't been submitted?" I didn't call them back immediately. I let them wonder. I let Victor try to handle it himself first. I learned later that Victor initially tried to dismiss the validation memo as a formality. He told partners it was just paperwork, nothing to worry about. But the partners knew better. They understood what that memo represented: independent verification that the system actually worked as promised. Without it, they were exposed to risk. Without it, the deal wasn't complete. When one of the partners finally called me directly, his voice was gentle but firm. "We need reassurance that the technical foundation is solid." I didn't attack Victor. I just told the truth. Victor's social media presence became almost manic after the initial announcement. He posted photos from industry conferences, gave interviews about innovative business models, shared articles praising his leadership. He appeared on podcasts discussing vision and strategy. I watched it all from my kitchen table. Each post, each interview, each congratulatory comment from people who didn't know the real story. And I kept my validation memo saved on my encrypted drive and signed. The deadline for submission passed quietly. No announcement, no press release, just a technical requirement that went unfulfilled. The partners didn't make noise about it publicly, but I knew from my contact list that questions were being asked internally. Where was the validation memo? Why hadn't the lead technical architect signed off? What did Karen Heinz's sudden departure mean for technical governance? Victor tried calling me 3 times in 1 week. I let every call go to voicemail. On the 4th attempt, he left a message, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "Karen, we need to talk about the validation paperwork. This is about professional obligation. Call me back." Professional obligation. The irony was painful. I deleted the voicemail without responding. The first official delay happened 3 weeks after the supposed deal closure. The press release was carefully worded, calling it a routine documentation review period required by international regulatory frameworks. Industry analysts accepted the explanation without much scrutiny. Delays were common in complex international deals. Nobody thought it was a crisis. But I watched the stock price carefully. It dropped 2% the day of the announcement, recovered slightly the next day, then started a slow decline as questions multiplied. Victor held a conference call with investors to reassure them. I didn't listen live, but a friend who still worked at the company sent me notes afterward. Victor had blamed administrative delays, regulatory complexity, the usual suspects. He'd sounded confident, authoritative, completely in control. Except he wasn't in control. Not anymore. Behind the scenes, I knew from my partner contacts, the situation was far more complicated. The European compliance team had flagged the missing validation memo as a material gap. The Asian subsidiary had raised questions. The South American team wanted independent verification. All questions I could have answered in 5 minutes. All questions Victor couldn't answer at all. The pressure continued building throughout the next month. Investors started asking more pointed questions during quarterly calls. Board members requested clarification on technical details Victor couldn't provide. Partners expressed concern about execution risk without the lead architect's sign-off. Victor responded with his usual playbook: buzzwords, confidence, reassurances that everything was under control. He hired consultants to write technical summaries. He brought in external advisors to review the architecture. He tried to recreate my validation memo using documentation I'd left behind. But nothing worked. Because the partners didn't trust consultants they'd never worked with. They didn't trust advisors who'd been hired just to paper over a problem. They trusted me, and I was gone. I watched from the outside as Victor's carefully constructed narrative started cracking. The confident CEO who'd closed a $5 billion deal was beginning to look like a man who'd celebrated too early. Industry contacts started reaching out to me. First casually, asking how I was doing. Then more directly, asking if I'd be interested in consulting work, in joining their teams. I took meetings. I listened to offers. The formal email arrived 6 weeks after I'd been fired. It came from Victor's corporate attorney, written in that careful legal language designed to threaten without quite making actionable threats. The letter demanded my cooperation in completing required documentation. It reminded me of confidentiality agreements and professional obligations. It suggested, delicately, that failure to provide necessary validation could be construed as breach of contract. It was a masterpiece of legal intimidation. It was also completely hollow. I didn't respond emotionally or defensively. Instead, I forwarded the email to my own attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia who specialized in employment disputes. She read it, laughed once, and sent back a 2-line response. They have no leverage here. Your contract ended when they terminated you. You have no obligation to provide post-employment services. I archived Victor's attorney's email in a folder labeled Evidence and went about my day. But I also sent copies of the email, along with documentation of my termination and the timeline of events, to a contact who worked in legal governance at one of the partner companies. Not to attack Victor. Just to make sure the partners had full context about why the validation memo hadn't been submitted. The response came back within hours, "Thank you for this context." The public slip happened during an investor call 2 months after my termination. Someone asked directly about my absence from the technical team, why the lead architect was no longer with the company given the deal's complexity. Victor laughed. It was meant to sound casual, confident, but even through the recorded audio I could hear the strain underneath. Karen wasn't critical to execution, he said. She was a valuable contributor, but the technical framework is solid and our current team is fully capable. The room on the call went quiet. You could hear it in the recording, that sudden absence of the usual supportive murmurs. Because everyone on that call knew Victor was lying. Industry professionals understood that lead architects don't become non-critical overnight. His attempt to minimize my role was so transparent, so obviously a face-saving measure, that it undermined his credibility. That lie spread faster than any rumor I could have started. Within 24 hours, 3 separate people had sent me the clip. Within a week, it was being referenced in industry forums. People started questioning his judgment, his honesty, his understanding of his own business. I didn't need to defend myself. The truth defended itself. An offer came from one of the international partners 3 months after my termination. Not from the company Victor had partnered with, but from a competitor who'd been watching the situation carefully. We're developing a similar licensing framework, the CEO explained over video call. We'd like to talk about you working with us. Not as an employee. As an independent consultant with proper royalty structure and governance rights built into the contract from day one. It was everything Victor had promised and then taken away. Fair compensation, respected expertise, contractual protection, honest partnership. I was tempted to accept immediately. But I knew that accepting too early would let Victor off the hook. He could blame my departure on me being recruited away. He could spin a narrative where I'd betrayed the company. So I did something strategic instead. I asked for time to consider the offer. And I let it be known through my network that I was considering it. I wanted Victor to know that his competitors were valuing what he'd thrown away. I wanted him to imagine me building something similar, something better. The partner CEO understood what I was doing. Take your time, he said with a slight smile. The board opened a formal governance review 4 months after my termination. The announcement was brief, corporate speak careful, describing it as a routine examination of deal execution protocols. But people inside the company said the mood was anything but routine. The board had received multiple complaints from partners about missing documentation. They'd seen the declining stock price. They'd noticed Victor's increasingly defensive behavior. They wanted answers. I was contacted as part of the review process through back channels by a compliance officer who'd always respected my work. She asked if I'd be willing to provide documentation of my contributions, context about my departure, relevant information about current compliance gaps. I provided everything requested. Professionally, comprehensively, without editorializing. I sent emails showing my technical contributions. Contract versions showing the validation requirements. Documentation proving my role as lead architect. Timeline showing how I was removed before completing required procedures. Facts. Just facts. No emotional appeals, no claims of mistreatment. The facts did all the talking I needed. Victor's confidence started turning into visible defensiveness. His public appearances became less frequent. His social media posts shifted from celebrating to defending. The second vote on the licensing deal was scheduled for 5 months after the original supposed closure. The delay had triggered renegotiation clauses that gave partners the right to review terms and adjust conditions. Those changed circumstances included the absence of the lead technical architect, missing validation documentation, and growing questions about whether the technical framework was as solid as originally represented. I wasn't there for the vote. But I heard about it afterward from 3 different sources, each telling slightly different versions of the same chaotic story. The meeting had started with presentations from technical consultants Victor had hired. They'd found gaps, inconsistencies, implementation risks. Not major failures, but enough uncertainty to make investors nervous. Partners had asked pointed questions about why the original architect's validation had never been received. Victor had tried to deflect, to assure them that current documentation was sufficient. Then someone had directly asked whether I'd refused to provide the validation memo out of spite or because I had legitimate concerns about system quality. The question was impossible for Victor to answer honestly. He tried to split the difference, suggesting I was no longer engaged so my perspective was outdated. Nobody bought it. The vote ended without resolution. The reputation shift happened gradually, then suddenly. Industry insiders who used to call Victor for quotes started calling me instead. Conference organizers who'd invited him to speak began reaching out to me for panel discussions. Articles that would have featured him 6 months ago now mention me as the technical architect behind the framework. My phone filled with opportunities. Not pity calls or sympathy offers, but genuine respect. People wanted my expertise, my perspective, my involvement in their projects. Meanwhile, Victor's public appearances stopped completely. His social media went quiet. The confident CEO who'd been everywhere simply vanished from view. People noticed. In an industry where visibility equals credibility, his silence was deafening. I started accepting some of the offers that came my way. Small consulting projects at first, helping companies avoid the kinds of pitfalls Victor had fallen into. Then larger engagements, strategic planning roles where my reputation preceded me. I was rebuilding, but not from scratch. I was building on the foundation of respect I'd earned over years, respect that Victor's betrayal hadn't damaged because people understood what had really happened. Competence doesn't disappear just because someone tries to erase it. The final trigger came from an unexpected source. The board's governance review had uncovered Victor's threatening email to me, the one where he'd demanded compliance and implied legal consequences. That email, examined alongside the timeline of my termination, the missing documentation, and the contract language about my role, painted a clear picture of mismanagement. Victor had fired his lead technical architect before securing the documentation legally required to complete the deal. Then he tried to intimidate me into providing that documentation after I no longer worked for him. He'd made promises to partners he couldn't keep. The board reviewed the evidence and reached conclusions that were obvious to anyone looking objectively. Victor had prioritized his ego over the deal's success. He'd created the mess he was now failing to clean up. The compliance review included all of this in their report to the full board. Not as accusations, but as timeline and documentation showing what occurred and consequences. Victor tried to defend his decisions, arguing that my removal was justified, that I'd become difficult to work with. But evidence contradicted every claim. My emails were professional. My work was exemplary. His decision wasn't about performance. It was about not sharing credit. The news broke on a Tuesday morning. $5 billion deal halted amid leadership concerns and documentation gaps. The article didn't mention Victor by name in the headline, but his name appeared repeatedly throughout. Quotes from unnamed sources described management decisions that undermined deal stability. References to technical leadership changes that created execution risk. Victor resigned within 2 weeks. There was no dramatic speech, no press conference, no opportunity for him to spin the narrative. Just a brief corporate statement thanking him for his service. The company's stock price actually increased slightly on the news of his resignation. The market interpreted his departure as a positive step. I didn't celebrate when I heard. I didn't call friends to gloat or post anything on social media. I just sat at my kitchen table, the same place I'd sat when watching him take credit for my work, and I exhaled slowly. It was over. Not in the dramatic Hollywood way where the villain gets publicly destroyed. Just in the quiet, inevitable way where consequences finally catch up with bad decisions. Victor had built his success on taking credit for other people's work. When he removed the person doing the work, the whole structure collapsed. I hadn't destroyed him. I just stopped protecting him from his own mistakes. The partners approached me again 6 weeks after Victor's resignation. This time the approach was formal, transparent, respectful. They wanted to revive the licensing deal with proper technical leadership and governance structure. The terms were different than the original agreement. Smaller in scope initially, more cautious in execution, with clear milestones and validation requirements built into every phase. No grand $5 billion headline. Just solid, careful partnership built on realistic expectations. And my compensation was fair. Actually generous. Royalties protected in writing. Governance rights clearly established. My name on the paperwork exactly where it belonged. I negotiated carefully, bringing my attorney Patricia into every discussion. We reviewed every clause, every appendix, every technical requirement. I wasn't going to be erased again. When I finally signed the revised agreement, it felt different than signing Victor's original contract. Not because the deal was bigger or the money was better, but because I was signing as an equal partner rather than an employee hoping for fair treatment. For the first time in years, I signed something that actually respected my work. The project launched 3 months later. Smaller headlines, but real progress instead of hollow celebration. I never spoke to Victor again after his resignation. No phone calls, no emails, no accidental encounters at industry events. He simply disappeared from my professional orbit as completely as he tried to erase me from his. I heard through contacts that he'd started a consulting firm, positioning himself as an expert on international licensing frameworks. The irony would have been painful if I'd cared enough to be hurt by it. But I didn't need revenge speeches or confrontations or closure. His downfall hadn't come from my attacks. It had come from his own arrogance, from his belief that competence was less important than confidence, from his assumption that he could erase people who'd built his systems. My success didn't require his failure. I was building something new, something better, something built on actual respect rather than exploitation. People sometimes asked me if I felt vindicated by how things turned out. I never quite knew how to answer that question. Vindication suggests I'd been fighting to prove something. But I hadn't been fighting. I'd just been refusing to help someone who'd betrayed me, refusing to validate work he'd stolen credit for, refusing to make his problems mine after he'd made me disposable. Today I lead projects on my own terms. I work with partners who respect my expertise, who value my perspective, who understand that technical architecture isn't just background noise supporting someone else's vision. I'm respected in my field, independent, and finally free from the constant anxiety of wondering when the next betrayal will come. I've built new systems, closed new deals, earned recognition that has my name attached correctly and permanently. Not because I needed to prove Victor wrong, but because I continued doing what I'd always done. Excellent work. Honest partnership. Systems that function because someone competent designed them. Victor tried to write me out of the story he was telling about himself. He wanted to be the visionary CEO who single-handedly architected a revolutionary deal. He needed me to disappear so that narrative could work. But stories have a way of revealing truth over time. People in the industry knew who'd really built that framework. Partners knew whose expertise they'd relied on. And when the deal collapsed without me, everyone understood exactly what Victor's leadership had been worth. He thought he was erasing me to claim my achievements as his own. Instead, he revealed exactly how replaceable he really was. Because the moment he tried to erase me from his story, he erased himself from mine. And my story, the one built on actual competence rather than borrowed glory, continued just fine without him. Better than fine, actually. It flourished. And that, more than any revenge I could have planned, was the perfect ending to a story that never really belonged to him in the first place. The best part? He never saw it coming. If you loved this story, hit that like button, subscribe for more mind-blowing revenge stories, share this with anyone who's been underestimated, and I'll see you next time. The end.